Hello, everybody. Today's video essay is going to be about the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, in particular, his critique of truth in the third essay of the genealogy of morality. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of overview of some of his main ideas, and then I'll launch into an analysis of what he has to say about both religion and science as being in need of a critique of truth. So he was born in 1844, died in 1900 in Germany. He began his career as a classical philologist before turning to philosophy, and he held a chair of classical philology at the University of Basel at the age of 24. So very impressive intellectual achievement for someone of so young in years. He eventually resigned due to health problems and began writing philosophy. And his physical illnesses really plagued him for his entire life and are a major theme of his writing from then onwards. He really does have this idea of human health, and he thinks that living inside certain ideologies makes us sick. And he himself was something of a victim of this. In 1889, he had a nervous breakdown and lived the remainder of his life under the care of his mother and sister. And it is primarily his sister that historians blame for the use of his ideas in anti-Semitic contexts. He was quite hostile to the notion of anti-Semitism. His elitism, as we might call it, was, by his own report, an elitism of the spirit, not of race. He thought that nationalism was silly. The key positive ideas that Nietzsche really coined that are relevant to an understanding of his critique of truth are quite famous. So I'll be a little brief with these because there are plenty of places that you can go to get into these ideas in more detail. But the first of which is the idea of that God is dead, which I believe he first mentions in the Gay Science. And this is the idea that philosophy can no longer depend on the Judeo-Christian God as a principle for its moral edifice. And the lack of such a being creates an existential crisis for modern living that will not go away. Now, I think Nietzsche's version of atheism is really important to contrast with a lot of modern or contemporary atheism, like the new atheists, for example, who have very dismissive ideas towards religion because they think that science tells us everything we need to know about the natural world, and that religious beliefs like in the Judeo-Christian God are silly. Nietzsche would certainly eschew such attitudes. The death of God is very important and difficult to accept, and it is not something we come to lightly, and it is not something that we can simply rest in scientific knowledge because, and this will become clear by the end of the talk, Nietzsche thinks that science and religion both suffer from a kind of addiction to what he'll call ascetic ideals, and that this paralyzes these disciplines or modes of discourse from being able to generate narratives that are conducive to human flourishing. So importantly for Nietzsche, God is dead and we have killed him. So this isn't just a matter of us coming to our senses through the liberation of scientific knowledge. It's a recognition that in our own value structures and institutions, we have kind of outgrown God, but without having fully come to terms with how central our ideas of the afterlife are to our very value systems, and that this is a very serious problem that that Nietzsche will make some very prescient predictions about in terms of how human culture will deal with this phenomenon from the 1900s onwards. Nietzsche's makes a distinction between two species of nihilism that arise in the context of dealing with the existential difficulty of God's death. First is passive nihilism, which is a kind of giving up. And the other is an active nihilism, which is an attitude of seeing what comes next, of making meaning rather than waiting for it to be delivered to you by now dead deity. The overman or the Übermensch is the person who comes next, the person who is truly powerful, having become a meaning-creating being in the aftermath of God's death. Importantly, Nietzsche did not think of himself as the Übermensch, right? He's self-aware enough to recognize that he is too much of a product of his time to be the instantiation of a new kind of person that he sees as coming forward to negotiate the meaning crisis in an active, curious, courageous way. The main psychological system that he erects to anticipate this new being is the will to power. And he thinks that this is the main drive that animates all human action. This drive he calls a saying yes to life. And he thinks that it can be turned also into a life-negating drive in the hands of priests. The other piece of psychological architecture, and this for me is the most interesting one, is the eternal return, which I understand is a kind of requisite optimism. So the eternal return is that you need to cultivate an attitude of radically affirming every contingency of life forever. It's an attitude of radical optimism. So unlike the notions of samsara and cyclic existence that we see in ancient Greece and India, we're not trying to escape the eternal return. The eternal return is a sort of thought experiment, which is that you must imagine that after you die, that you will relive this life, this exact life, not some new version on the basis of your karma, but this precise life in every detail. And you must learn to see that as the best news you've ever heard. You have to enthusiastically say yes to every contingent detail of your life. That is the eternal return as requisite optimism. And it is a truly radical optimism, right? Because most of us have suffered enough that we don't want to suffer anymore. And the idea of repeating that suffering verbatim is usually quite jarring. So those are sort of the background ideas. One thing I always like to say to my students when I'm preparing them to read Nietzsche is that he writes in a very specific way. He's a very powerful and passionate authorial voice, and it is designed to disturb the reader. He's a kind of caricature situated against an entrenched normative order that he's trying to deconstruct and disrupt. So he's living in a time where the ascendancy of the Christian church is still quite strong, and he's trying to attack it. And in order to attack it in a way that is powerful enough to disturb the status quo, he has to kind of turn himself into a bit of a caricature. And so this means that you need to meet Nietzsche at a certain distance. So from too close up, he looks like a moral relativist and a pig. He says terrible things, he's obnoxious, and he's rude, and sometimes sexist and racist. So these are unfortunate features of his writing that need to be taken with a certain grain of salt and a certain level of sensitivity. But from too far away, if you don't go close up, deep enough in, he looks like he has very little of intelligence to say. There's a lot of vague, foot stomping and hand waving going on. But from the right distance, like a fine piece of art, I think he has something powerful to say about the historical situation of human beings and how these conditions shape the institutions which often form the basis of our normative reasoning. And this is the point he wants us to take on. Nietzsche thinks of himself as a kind of psychologist, and that a proper philosophical gaze on any topic, especially topics of morality, should not be in pursuit of ahistorical or atemporal essences like Platonic forms. By contrast, Nietzsche thinks there are only two useful philosophical questions to ask about any given phenomena that we might want to analyze. What are its origins, and what is its value? And in the genealogy, Nietzsche applies these questions to Judeo-Christian morality. And his target here is the widespread conviction that these morals represent timeless truths rather than historically and culturally contingent, situated convictions that evolved into what they are and what they were on the basis of human activity. It is very easy in this light to interpret his moral psychology as a kind of cultural relativism, the view that all there is to morality is the collective beliefs of historically situated cultures. But I think this would be an error. Nietzsche thinks that there are facts about human nature and that Judeo-Christian morality has repressed our understanding of these facts and therefore made us unhealthy, both psychologically and physiologically. And it is that connection between the physiological and the psychological and Nietzsche's thinking, I think, that makes him such an interesting philosopher and worthy of study. So to begin, I want to read to you a citation from the preface of the Genealogy of Morality, which says, we are unknown to ourselves, we knowers, and for good reason. We have never sought ourselves. How then should it happen that we find ourselves one day? He continues, we have no right to be single in anything. We may neither err singly nor hit upon the truth singly. Rather, with the necessity with which a tree bears its fruit, our thoughts grow out of us, our values, our yeses and nos, and ifs and whethers, the whole lot related and connected among themselves, witnesses to one will, one health, one earthly kingdom, one sun. This point here, especially in the second citation, is very central to Nietzsche's project. He's trying to show that all of our questions and answers, all of our value systems, all of them are born out of a complicated historical process. And all the institutions and presuppositions, all things that count for us as obvious and certain, emerge out of an ambiguous and uncertain past. And yet, in spite of that kind of branching, ambiguous, evolving structure, he does think that we are all witnesses to one health and one earthly kingdom, one sun, that there is a unity in us as the kinds of creatures that we are together on this earth. And so his role as a thinker is to help us understand the historical conditioning process that structures our value systems, in the hope that the self-awareness that this brings us closer to understanding our own volitions, our own health, and our own community. Nietzsche's main worry about Judeo-Christian morality is that it's a kind of moral piety that stifles the human will to power. So he often has these exclamation points all over his work where he says, bad air, like he's literally choking. These are the physiological costs of having a deformed soul, of living under ideology that is so entrenched into the pre-reflective background of everyone's presuppositions that we don't even have the tools to ask critical questions about it. And the main stress that this creates for us, according to Nietzsche, is that our instincts become repressed. And he says in the second treatise that all instincts that do not discharge themselves outwardly turn themselves inwards. And this is what I call the internalizing of man. Thus first grows in man that which he later calls his soul. Now, even though Nietzsche is giving a kind of historical, naturalized account of the inner life of human beings, and he is attacking or trying to deconstruct a kind of self-effacing passive morality, he is not claiming that we can or should return to a previous stage of health. We cannot go back. We must go forward. So he says that let us immediately add that, on the other hand, with the appearance on earth of an animal soul turned against itself, taking sides against itself, something so new, deep, unheard of, enigmatic, contradictory, and full of future has come into being, that the appearance of the earth was thereby essentially changed. So he really thinks that the internalization, the self-awareness of the human being is what happens when its instincts are turned inwards on itself and repressed, and therefore kind of hollow us out and create an inner life for us that is no longer just about the expression of the will, but is contemplative, is reflective. And the idea is that this self-aware being generates further stifle human flourishing. And so in the last part of the text, Nietzsche explores the notion of an ascetic ideal. For philosophers, ascetic ideals refer to those ideas that claim that the world of sense is in some way bad or illusory. And these are ideas that for Nietzsche are life negating. This is something that Nietzsche attacks because he thinks that this kind of philosophizing represents a kind of self-denial that looks for a world away from the one that we have, and this he cannot tolerate. So he says, in the third treatise, The idea we are fighting about here is the valuation of our life on the part of an ascetic priest. He relates our life together with that which it belongs, nature, world, the entire sphere of becoming and transitoriness, to an entirely different kind of existence, which opposes and excludes, unless perhaps it were to turn against itself, to negate itself. In this sense, the case of an ascetic ideal, life is held to be a bridge for that existence. The ascetic ideal treats life as a wrong path that one must finally retrace back to the point where it began, or as an error that one refutes through deeds, should refute, for he demands that one go along with him. Where he can, he forces his valuation of existence. What does that mean? Such a monstrous manner of valuation is not inscribed into the history of humankind as an exception and a curiosity, as one of the broadest and longest facts there is. Read from a distant star, the majuscule script of our earthly existence would perhaps tempt one to conclude that the earth is the true ascetic star, a nook of discontented, arrogant, and repulsive creatures who could not get rid of a deep displeasure with themselves, with the earth, with all life, and who cause themselves as much pain as possible out of pleasure in causing pain, probably their only pleasure. Let us consider, after all, how regularly, how universally, how in almost all ages the ascetic priest emerges. He does not belong to any single race. He flourishes everywhere. He grows forth from every social rank. Marvelous citation. I love the description of Earth as a nook of discontented, arrogant, and repulsive creatures who could not get rid of a deep displeasure with themselves. Unbelievable. So what he's rebelling against here on a philosophical level is the idea that the phenomenal world, the world that we experience, many philosophies and religion treat that world, the world of appearances, of changes, of senses, as being ultimately false or illusory with respect to an hitherto unexperienced reality, which Nietzsche analyzes psychologically as a kind of internalized self-denial that prevents us from fully exerting ourselves, our will to power in the service and celebration of life. So the contrast here is between the felt, instinctive understanding of life and its values versus that which is constructed against those instincts to invalidate and falsify that life. Nietzsche thinks that not only is this internalized life-denying impulse of ascetic ideals wrong, but it is bad for us. It makes us sickly and weak. So here's the question we have to ask then. Why do we do this? Why turn inwards like this? Why turn against life? Why embrace an idea that life should be negated or transcended or overcome? Why are such philosophies so widespread? The answer is simple: suffering. We want to escape from it, or at least to give it some meaning. The priest gives us this meaning by claiming that it is our fault that we suffer, and we must therefore seek absolution either in God or in a purified otherworldly consciousness. This is where Nietzsche's critique of truth starts to emerge, because according to Nietzsche, modernity has tried to dispense with this kind of thinking by embracing science. But Nietzsche claims that science and scientifically modern philosophy still fall prey to a new form of the ascetic ideal. He claims our entire modern science is said to be witness to this modern science, which as a true philosophy of reality, clearly believes in itself alone, clearly possesses the courage of itself, the will to itself, and has so far got along well enough without God and the beyond, and virtues that negate. Nevertheless, in my case, one accomplishes nothing with such noise and agitator babble. These trumpeters of reality are bad musicians. Why is he so down on science? Nietzsche thinks that science is naive to its own philosophical underpinnings, and that those philosophical underpinnings represent a further commitment to an atheistic version of an ascetic ideal, a life-denying principle. So recall that Nietzsche's methodological starting point for philosophy is to ask of a given phenomena what its origins are and what its value is. He claims that science must ask itself these same questions, because if it does not, or so he claims, we must be wary of it sneaking in a life-denying ascetic ideal into its method and into its claims. So the specific puzzle that Nietzsche thinks science shares with religion is what he calls the will to truth. And he says of the will to truth that science itself is now in need of a justification, which is not to say that there is one. On this question, just look at the earliest and most recent philosophies. All of them lack a consciousness of the extent to which the will to truth itself first needs a justification. Here there is a gap in every philosophy. Why is that? Because the ascetic ideal has until now been lord over all philosophy. Because truth was posited as being, as God, as highest authority. Because truth was simply not permitted to be a problem. Do you understand this permitted? From the moment belief in a God of the ascetic ideal is negated, there is also a new problem, that of the value of truth. The will to truth is in need of a critique. Let us thus define our own task. The value of truth is for once to be experimentally called into question. Why do we need to analyze the value of truth? Because not all truths bear on the question of the origin and health of human beings. When we pursue truths that do not bear on these questions, we become sickly and ignore our existential predicaments. We create an image of a universe that does not include us. And such pursuits are a form of self-erasure. And this contributes to our harm. Science also rests on the same ground as the ascetic ideal when calculated physiologically. A certain impoverishment of life is a presupposition here as well as there. The affects become cool, the tempo slowed, dialectic in place of instinct, seriousness impressed on faces and gestures, seriousness, this most unmistakable mark of the more laborious metabolism of a struggling, harder working life. Nietzsche believes that the death of God and the deep entrenchment of ascetic ideals that remain in the wake of God's departure create a massive upheaval of conflict and harm for people. And given that Nietzsche's final works and eventual death were followed by 2 world wars, who could deny the prescience of this prediction? He says, it is from the will to truth's becoming conscious of itself that from now on, there is no doubt about it, morality will gradually perish. That great spectacle in 100 acts that is reserved for Europe's next 2 centuries, the most terrible, the most questionable, and perhaps also most hopeful of all spectacles. Perhaps this is just what the ascetic ideal means, that something was lacking, that an enormous void surrounded man. He did not know how to justify, to explain, to affirm himself. He suffered from the problem of his own meaning. And in the absence of an apodictic foundation for anchoring that need for meaning, we look for it in other places. We look for it in nationalism. That didn't work out too well. We look for it in technology. In less than 100 years, we have boiled the biosphere. So we are in a meaning crisis that has lasted for, about 100 years. We're about halfway through the spectacle that Nietzsche predicted. And look at what we've done in just over 120 years. He says, one simply cannot conceal from oneself what all the willing that has received its direction from the ascetic ideal actually expresses. This hatred of the human, still more of the animal, still more of the material, this abhorrence of the senses, of reason itself, this fear of happiness and of beauty, this longing away from all appearance, change, becoming, death, wish, longing itself. All of this means, let us dare to grasp this, a will to nothingness, an aversion to life, a rebellion against the most fundamental presuppositions of life. But it is and remains a will. And to say again, at the end of what I said at the beginning, man would much rather will nothingness than not will. There is nothing we would not do to fill the void left by the death of God. We must therefore make hard choices about what the meaning of our lives will be. But since we are deeply prone to believe that the meaning is offered to us from on high, this task of creating our own meaning in ways that are conducive to our flourishing is a task for which we're not really well suited. And that's why Nietzsche thinks that the next 100 years, or from when he was writing 200 years, we're going to be such a violent spectacle because our capacity to fill the void has not yet been honed by skill. And so we fill the void with nationalism. We fill the void with technology. We fill the void with material consumption. And when we try to do that, we create horrors. and we become even more sickly and weak and numb. And that is the existential predicament that faces modern humanity, the meaning crisis that Nietzsche predicted. And who could deny that we are in the full throes of that now, even as we watch the polar ice caps melt, and even with another school shooting. So perhaps not the most optimistic of posts, but I think a relevant one. Okay, take care, everybody.